The bullet shattered the morning silence before Margaret Hayes could even scream. She watched her husband Samuel crumple behind their overturned supply wagon, his gentle hands that had once taught children to read now clutching desperately at the spreading crimson stain across his chest. The Comanche war party that had descended upon their missionary convoy moved like shadows given flesh, their painted faces terrible in the harsh Nevada sun. And before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret pressed herself against the wagon wheel, her missionary's simple grey dress already torn from scrambling across rocky ground. 3 months ago, she had stood before the Boston Women's Missionary Society, her auburn hair pinned severely back, her voice clear and unwavering as she spoke of bringing Christian education to the frontier territories. She had never told a lie in her 28 years of life, a trait that had made her both respected and feared in Boston society. That same rigid honesty had driven her to volunteer for the most dangerous assignment when other missionaries hesitated. Now, that truth-telling nature seemed a bitter irony as she witnessed truths too horrible for words. Samuel's eyes found hers across the chaos, and she saw him mouth her name before his gaze went forever still. Margaret bit down on her own scream, tasting blood as her teeth cut into her lip. Around her, the other members of their small missionary group met similar fates. Reverend Peterson, who had blessed their marriage just 2 years prior, fell with an arrow through his throat. Mrs. Coleman, who had worried constantly about leaving her garden back in Massachusetts, would never tend flowers again. The attack had come without warning as they made their way through Devil's Canyon, a narrow pass that their guide had assured them was the safest route to the San Carlos Reservation. Their mission had been simple in concept, revolutionary in practice: establish a school that would serve both white settlers' children and Apache youth, teaching literacy and mathematics alongside respect for different cultures. Margaret had spent months preparing, learning basic Apache phrases, studying tribal customs, determined to build bridges rather than walls. Samuel had supported her unconventional approach, even when the missionary board expressed reservations about a woman who spoke too directly, who asked uncomfortable questions about the treatment of native peoples. Truth is truth, Margaret had told them during her final interview. God's word doesn't change based on the color of a child's skin or the language they speak at home. That conviction had carried her across 2,000 miles of harsh frontier, through dust storms and flash floods, past hostile towns where their integrated mission school plans met with open hostility. Some settlements refused them supplies when they learned of their intentions. Others tried to convince Samuel to abandon his wife's dangerous notions and establish a proper Christian school for white children only. But Samuel had believed in her vision as firmly as she did. During their journey, they had discussed a curriculum that would include both English literature and Apache oral traditions, mathematics alongside traditional ecological knowledge. Margaret had filled 3 journals with notes and observations, preparing for the revolutionary educational experiment they hoped to create. The screaming had stopped now. Margaret lifted her head cautiously, peering around the wagon wheel. The Comanche raiders moved efficiently among the wreckage, gathering weapons, supplies, anything of value. Their leader, a tall warrior with intricate tattoos covering his arms, directed the others with quiet authority. Unlike the wild savages described in Eastern newspapers, these men moved with discipline and purpose. Margaret's breath caught as the leader turned in her direction. His dark eyes swept the area methodically, and she knew her hiding place would be discovered within moments. Her hand instinctively moved to the small leather journal tucked inside her dress, the one containing all her mission plans, her hopes, for bridging 2 worlds that seemed destined for conflict. A younger warrior approached the leader, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. Margaret caught fragments of words she had studied during her preparation, but the speed and dialect made comprehension impossible. The leader nodded once, then pointed directly toward her hiding place. "Come out," he called in accented but clear English. "We know you are there." Margaret closed her eyes, saying a silent prayer for strength. When she opened them again, her expression had hardened with resolve. If she was to die, she would die as she had lived, speaking truth without fear or compromise. She stood slowly, her hands visible and empty, her chin raised with the dignity that had characterized her entire life. The Comanche leader studied her with obvious curiosity. She was clearly different from the other missionary women they had encountered, her bearing proud rather than cowering, her gaze direct rather than averted. When she spoke, her voice carried across the canyon with startling clarity. "My name is Margaret Hayes. I am a teacher. My husband and I came here to build a school for all children, white and Apache both." The leader's eyebrows rose slightly at her directness. Most captives pleaded for mercy or offered ransom. This woman stated facts as if delivering a lecture. To a classroom. "Why would white teacher want Apache children?" he asked, genuine puzzlement in his voice. "Because children are children," Margaret replied without hesitation. "Knowledge belongs to everyone, not just those born with pale skin. An Apache child who learns to read has the same value as any child in Boston." Several warriors exchanged glances at this unexpected response. The leader stepped closer, studying Margaret's face for signs of deception. Her unusual honesty had always made her easy to read, and now that transparency served her in an unexpected way. "You speak strange words for white woman," he observed. "Your people do not usually see Apache children as having worth." "Then my people are wrong," Margaret said simply. "I have spent my life telling the truth, even when others prefer comfortable lies. The truth is that prejudice blinds us to the humanity in each other." The leader was silent for a long moment, considering her words. Behind him, his warriors waited with practiced patience while he made his decision. Margaret could see them assessing her practical value, her potential for ransom or trade. She was young enough, strong enough to be useful, but more than that, she sensed their curiosity about this white woman who spoke of Apache children with genuine respect. "Your husband," the leader said finally, glancing toward Samuel's still form. "He believed these same truths?" Grief threatened to overwhelm Margaret's composure, but she forced herself to answer steadily. "He believed in justice, in the worth of every human soul. He died for those beliefs." "Many die for beliefs," the warrior replied. "Question is whether beliefs are worth dying for." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "Some truths are worth any price. The truth is that children deserve education regardless of their heritage. The truth that different peoples can learn from each other rather than destroying each other. The truth is that understanding is stronger than hatred." The leader studied her for another long moment, then turned to consult with his warriors in rapid Apache. Margaret caught occasional words, but the conversation moved too quickly for her limited vocabulary. She used the time to control her grief, to prepare mentally for whatever decision they reached. When the consultation ended, the leader approached her again. "My name is Swift Eagle. I am war chief of the Red River Band. You will come with us." "And if I refuse?" Margaret asked, not from defiance but from her compulsive need to understand the full truth of any situation. Swift Eagle's expression remained impassive. "Then you join your husband. Choice is yours." Margaret looked once more at Samuel's body, at the destroyed dreams scattered among the wreckage of their wagon. She thought of the journals filled with lesson plans that would never be taught, the hope for understanding that had died with him in this lonely canyon. But the choice before her was clear. Death would serve no purpose, would advance no cause, would teach no children. If there was even the smallest chance that her survival might somehow further the work she and Samuel had died attempting, she had to take it. "I choose to live," she said quietly, "but I will not beg for my life or compromise my principles to preserve it." Swift Eagle nodded approvingly. "Good. Begging shows weakness. Principles show strength." He gestured to one of his warriors who brought forward a horse. "You will ride, keep up or be left behind." As Margaret was helped onto the horse, she took one final look at the scene of devastation. The mission that had brought her west was finished, but perhaps its purpose could be fulfilled in ways she had never imagined. Her journals might be lost, but the knowledge in her mind remained intact. Her plans for an integrated school might be destroyed, but her commitment to truth and education burned as strongly as ever. The Comanche war party moved out of Devil's Canyon as efficiently as they had arrived, leaving behind only the silence of the dead and the circling of carrion birds. Margaret rode among them, her spine straight despite her grief, her mind already working to understand this new world she had been thrust into. She had always believed that truth was the most powerful force in human affairs. Now she would discover whether that belief could survive in a world where truth meant the difference between life and death, where honesty might be her only weapon against forces she barely comprehended. The journey ahead would test every conviction she had ever held, every principle that had guided her sheltered Boston life. But Margaret Hayes had never learned to lie, had never developed the skill of convenient self-deception that enabled others to avoid uncomfortable realities. That rigid honesty had sometimes made her life difficult in civilized society. In the harsh world of the frontier, surrounded by warriors whose language and customs she barely understood, it might prove to be either her salvation or her doom. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, leaving behind the last traces of the world she had known, Margaret began to understand that her real education was just beginning. Everything she thought she knew about strength, about survival, about the nature of truth itself would be challenged in the days ahead. Behind them, the sun climbed higher over Devil's Canyon, illuminating the scattered remains of dreams that had been 3 years in the making and 3 minutes in the dying. But ahead lay possibilities that no mission board had ever conceived, lessons that no classroom could have taught, and truths that would reshape everything Margaret Hayes thought she knew about herself and the world she lived in. The horse's hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth, carrying her toward a future as uncertain as it was unavoidable. In her heart, she carried Samuel's memory and their shared vision of understanding between peoples. In her mind, she carried the accumulated knowledge of 28 years of education and experience, and in her soul, she carried the unshakable conviction that truth, however difficult or dangerous, remained the foundation upon which any meaningful life must be built. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Comanche camp materialized from the landscape like a mirage-given substance. Margaret had ridden for 3 days through terrain that shifted from rocky canyons to rolling grasslands, her body aching from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. Swift Eagle had maintained a punishing pace, stopping only briefly for water and rest. Now, as they created a low hill, she saw dozens of hide dwellings scattered along a clear running creek, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing among the horses. It looked nothing like the savage encampments described in Eastern newspapers. The tipis were arranged with obvious consideration for wind patterns and water access. Gardens flourished near the creek bank. Women moved purposefully between dwellings, their clothing richly decorated with beadwork and quillwork that spoke of skilled craftsmanship and cultural sophistication. Margaret's arrival caused an immediate stir. Warriors emerged from the teepees, their faces painted for war, giving way to expressions of curiosity as they examined the white woman Swift Eagle had brought to their camp. Women gathered in small groups, speaking in rapid Comanche, while their dark eyes assessed this unexpected addition to their community. A woman approached Swift Eagle as he dismounted, her graying hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the afternoon light. She spoke with the authority of age and status, her tone questioning but not hostile. Swift Eagle responded in measured phrases, occasionally gesturing toward Margaret. Though she couldn't understand the words, Margaret sensed she was being evaluated, her fate discussed with the casual efficiency of people accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "What is your name?" Margaret asked the woman directly, her teacher's instincts overriding the diplomatic silence that might have been wiser. The woman's eyebrows rose in surprise. Few captives addressed their captors so boldly, particularly not in the first hours of their arrival. She studied Margaret's face, noting the direct gaze, the absence of the cowering fear she expected from white prisoners. "Singing Bird," she replied in careful English. "I am mother to Swift Eagle. You speak to me without permission. This shows either courage or foolishness." "Probably both," Margaret admitted with characteristic honesty. "But I've never found much purpose in pretending to be something I'm not. I'm a teacher. Asking questions and seeking truth is what I do." Singing Bird's weathered face creased in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Teacher who teaches what? How to steal land from people who lived on it for many generations." The directness of the question caught Margaret off guard, but she answered without hesitation. "I taught children to read and write, but I also taught them that every culture has wisdom worth learning. I came west to build a school that would serve both white and Apache children." "Apache?" Singing Bird's expression hardened. "You know, Apache. I studied their language and customs," Margaret explained. "I believe children learn best when their heritage is respected, not destroyed." Several Comanche had gathered to listen to this exchange, their faces showing varying degrees of skepticism and interest. A young warrior with intricate tattoos covering his chest stepped forward, his expression openly hostile. "More white lies," he said in English, heavily accented but clearly understandable. "White teachers come to steal children's minds, make them ashamed of Comanche ways." Margaret turned to face him directly. "Some do," she agreed, her honesty startling the listeners. "I've seen mission schools that try to beat the Indian out of children, and it's wrong. But that's not what I believe education should be." The young warrior's eyes narrowed. "You admit your people try to destroy us?" "Some of them do," Margaret replied steadily. "Just as some of your people raid and kill innocent families. Truth is complicated. Not all white people are the same, just as not all Comanche are the same." The camp fell silent at her words. Captives were expected to plead for mercy or maintain frightened silence, not offer complex analyses of cultural conflict. Swift Eagle watched this exchange with growing interest, noting how his people responded to this woman's unexpected directness. "You speak dangerous truths," he observed. "Such words could anger warriors who lost family to white settlers." "Truth is often dangerous," Margaret replied, "but lies are more dangerous in the long run. They prevent understanding, and without understanding, the killing never stops." Singing Bird studied Margaret thoughtfully. "You have children of your own?" Pain flickered across Margaret's features. "No. My husband and I, we hoped for children. Someday, we wanted to create something better for the next generation. And now your husband is dead," the older woman continued, with the brutal directness Margaret was beginning to recognize as a Comanche trait. "Yes," Margaret's voice remained, steady despite the grief that threatened to overwhelm her. "But his death doesn't make our beliefs wrong. It just makes them more urgent." An elderly man approached the group, his movement slow but dignified. The others showed him immediate respect, stepping aside to allow him access to Margaret. His hair was white as winter snow, his face deeply lined, but his eyes held sharp intelligence. "This is Walking Bear," Swift Eagle explained. "He is our peace chief, keeper of our laws and traditions." Walking Bear circled Margaret slowly, examining her as he might assess a horse or weapon. When he spoke, his English was more fluent than the others, suggesting years of interaction with white traders and officials. "You claim to respect Apache ways," he said finally. "But you are not Apache. You are not Comanche. Why should native children learn from someone who knows nothing of their true heritage?" It was a fair question, one that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Margaret's educational philosophy. She considered her response carefully, aware that dozens of eyes watched her, that her answer might determine whether she lived or died. "Because I can teach them to navigate the white world without losing their own identity," she said finally. "Reading and writing are tools, like knives or horses. Tools can be used to preserve culture or destroy it, depending on who wields them. I wanted to put those tools in the hands of native children so they could defend their heritage with knowledge." Walking Bear's expression remained impassive. Pretty words, but white teachers always speak of helping native children. Then those children return to their people speaking only English, ashamed of their parents' ways. Then those teachers failed. Margaret replied bluntly. "A true education builds on what children already know, doesn't try to replace it. I spent months learning Apache customs before coming west because I understood that I needed to honor their knowledge to earn the right to share mine." The peace chief's eyes sharpened with interest. "What Apache customs did you learn?" Margaret drew upon the months of preparation she had undertaken, describing the complex kinship systems, the seasonal ceremonies, the sophisticated ecological knowledge that governed Apache agricultural and hunting practices. As she spoke, she noticed several Comanche nodding approvingly at her accurate understanding of their neighbors' ways. "Impressive," Walking Bear acknowledged when she finished. "But knowledge of customs is not wisdom. Wisdom comes from living through hardship, from understanding the true cost of survival." "You're right," Margaret agreed. "I know facts about your people, but I don't understand what it means to live with them. That's why I'm willing to learn." To the key, Old Chief studied her face, searching for signs of deception or hidden agenda. Margaret met his gaze steadily, her lifelong habit of honesty serving her well in this moment of scrutiny. "Swift Eagle tells me you chose to live rather than die with your husband," Walking Bear continued. "Why? White women usually prefer death to capture." The question struck at Margaret's deepest fears and doubts. She had asked herself the same thing during the long ride to the camp, wondering if her choice to survive represented wisdom or cowardice. "Because death would have served no purpose," she answered slowly. "My husband and I came west to build bridges between peoples. If I die, that work dies with me. If I live, perhaps I can still find ways to honor what we tried to accomplish. Even as a captive? Even if you never see your own people again?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of his question. When she spoke, her voice carried the conviction that had driven her across 2,000 miles of frontier. "Knowledge doesn't belong to any one person," she said finally. "If I can teach even one child to read, if I can help preserve one story or tradition that might otherwise be lost, if I can show that understanding is possible between different worlds, then my life has meaning." Walking Bear exchanged a meaningful look with Swift Eagle and Singing Bird. Some communication passed between them that Margaret couldn't interpret, but she sensed that her answers had surprised them. "You will stay in my lodge," Singing Bird announced abruptly. "I will watch you, teach you our ways. If you prove worthy of trust, perhaps you live. If not—" She shrugged expressively. "I understand," Margaret replied. "I accept your conditions." "Do not thank me yet," the older woman warned. "Comanche ways are hard. You have soft hands, soft life. Here you must work or starve. You must earn a place among us." Margaret looked down at her hands, noting the calluses from her journey west, the cuts and scratches from 3 days of hard riding. "I'm stronger than I look," she said quietly, "and I learn quickly." As the crowd began to disperse, the young warrior who had challenged her earlier approached again. His hostility seemed tempered by curiosity now, though suspicion still colored his expression. "I am Iron Wolf," he said stiffly. "I fought your soldiers at Antelope Creek, saw how they kept promises to my people. Why should I believe you are different?" Margaret studied his face, noting the scars that spoke of violent encounters, the pain that lay beneath his anger. "Because I'm not a soldier," she replied simply. "And because I don't make promises I can't keep. I only promise to tell you the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." "Truth like what?" "Truth like the fact that many of my people see yours as obstacles to be removed, rather than human beings deserving of respect. Truth is like the fact that both sides have committed atrocities in this conflict. Truth is like the fact that unless we find ways to understand each other, the killing will continue until one side or the other is destroyed." Iron Wolf's jaw tightened at her words. "You think Comanche will be destroyed. I think everyone will be destroyed if this continues." Margaret answered honestly. "Hatred consumes the hater as much as the hated. Victory achieved through genocide leaves nobody truly victorious." The young warrior stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Margaret watched him go, sensing that she had planted seeds of thought in hostile ground. Whether those seeds would grow or be trampled remained to be seen. Singing Bird touched her arm, drawing her attention back to more immediate concerns. "Come, I show you where you sleep, what work you do. Tomorrow learning begins." As Margaret followed the older woman toward one of the larger teepees, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Some held curiosity, others suspicion. A few showed outright hostility. She was walking into a world where every word, every action would be scrutinized, where her commitment to truth would be tested in ways she had never imagined. Behind her, the sun was setting over the camp, painting the hide. Dwellings in golden light. Ahead lay challenges that would test not only her survival skills, but the very foundations of her beliefs about education, culture, and human nature. Margaret Hayes had always prided herself on seeing the world clearly, without the comfortable illusions that allowed others to avoid difficult truths. Now she would discover whether that clarity would prove to be a blessing or a curse in a world where truth itself was viewed through the lens of centuries of conflict and misunderstanding. Dawn came with the sound of children's laughter, a sound so familiar yet foreign that Margaret woke with tears on her cheeks. For a moment, suspended between sleep and consciousness, she forgot where she was. Then the reality of the teepee walls around her, the scratchy buffalo hiding beneath her body, the smoky scent of the dying fire brought her fully awake. Singing. Bird was already moving about the dwelling with practiced efficiency, preparing for the day ahead. She glanced at Margaret with an expression that mixed curiosity with challenge. "Sun is up. Work begins," she announced. "First lesson, Comanche women rise before men, prepare food, tend fires. You wish to live among us. You learn our ways." Margaret sat up, her body protesting after a night on the hard ground. Her missionary training had included some preparation for frontier hardships, but nothing had prepared her for the bone-deep exhaustion that came from 3 days of hard riding followed by the emotional strain of her first day in the camp. "What work do you need me to do?" she asked, pushing aside her discomfort. Her father had taught her that honest labor was the foundation of good character, a lesson that served her well now. Singing Bird studied her face, perhaps looking for signs of resistance or disdain. Finding none, she nodded approvingly. First, water. Creek is there. She pointed toward the edge of the camp. Fill these. She indicated several leather containers. Then help prepare the morning meal. Margaret picked up the water containers, surprised by their weight even when empty. As she made her way toward the creek, she became aware of the camp coming alive around her. Warriors checked their weapons and horses. Women kindled cooking fires and began preparing food. Children played elaborate games that seemed to involve both hunting skills and storytelling. At the creek, she encountered other women drawing water. They watched her with open curiosity, their conversations stopping when she approached. Margaret smiled and nodded politely, receiving mostly blank stares in return. One young woman, however, returned her smile tentatively. "You are the teacher," the woman said in halting English. "I am moon dancing. I speak some white man's words." "I'm Margaret," she replied, grateful for any friendly contact. "Where did you learn English?" "Trading post. I go with my husband to trade buffalo robes for metal things, cloth." Moondancing's expression grew more serious. "You really want to teach Indian children?" The question held layers of meaning that Margaret was only beginning to understand. She set down her water containers and faced the woman directly. "Yes, I believe all children deserve education, but not the kind that destroys who they are. I want to teach them skills they can use to protect their people and preserve their culture." Moondancing studied her face carefully. "My son is 6, winters old. Smart boy, learns fast, but I fear white man's school will steal his spirit, make him ashamed of his mother." Margaret felt a familiar passion stirring, the same drive that had brought her west, despite the dangers. It doesn't have to be that way. Education should build on what children already know, not replace it. Your son could learn to read and write while also learning traditional hunting skills and stories. Knowledge should add to identity, not subtract from it. "Pretty words," Moondancing said, echoing the skepticism Margaret had encountered repeatedly. "But how do I know you speak the truth? How do I know you won't try to steal my son's heart for your God, your ways?" It was a fair question, one that struck at the heart of Margaret's mission. She thought carefully before answering, aware that her words might determine whether this woman would ever trust her with her child. "Because I've seen what happens when education is used as a weapon against culture," she said finally. "I've visited mission schools where children are forbidden to speak their native languages, where they're punished for practicing traditional customs. It's wrong. It doesn't create educated citizens. It creates lost souls who belong nowhere." Moondancing's eyes widened slightly. Few white people admitted to flaws in their own systems, and fewer still understood the profound damage caused by forced assimilation. "Have you seen this yourself?" she asked. "Yes. In Boston, I met a young Lakota man who had been taken to a boarding school as a child. He could recite Shakespeare perfectly, but he had forgotten his grandmother's stories. He could calculate complex mathematics, but he couldn't remember the prayers his father had taught him." Margaret's voice grew heavy with the memory. "He was educated but not whole. That's not what I want for any child." The two women worked together in companionable silence for a while, filling their containers with the clear creek water. As they prepared to return to camp, Moondancing spoke again. "If you stay, if you prove yourself worthy of trust, I might consider letting you teach my son. But you must prove yourself first. Words are easy. Actions show true heart." Margaret nodded, understanding the weight of that conditional trust. "I'll prove myself through my actions, not my promises." Back at Singing Bird's teepee, Margaret threw herself into learning the intricate skills required for daily survival. Under the older woman's sometimes patient, sometimes exasperated tutelage, she learned to maintain cooking fires, to prepare unfamiliar foods, to repair and maintain clothing and equipment. Her first attempt at cooking resulted in burned rabbit and bitter tea, earning sharp criticism from Singing Bird and amused looks from passing children. Her efforts at mending a torn leather shirt produced uneven stitches that would never hold under stress. But Margaret persisted, driven by the same determination that had carried her through her education and across the frontier. "You learn slowly," Singing Bird observed after Margaret's third failed attempt at preparing pemmican, a concentrated food made from dried meat, fat and berries. "But you try again each time. This is good. Smart person who refuses to learn is useless. Stubborn person who keeps trying might become useful." The backhanded compliment felt like a victory to Margaret. She was beginning to understand that praise was rarely given directly in Comanche culture, but rather expressed through continued instruction and gradually increased responsibilities. As the days passed, Margaret found herself drawn into the complex social dynamics of the camp. She observed the intricate relationships between families, the careful protocols that governed interactions between different age groups and genders, the sophisticated systems of resource sharing and conflict resolution that kept the community functioning smoothly. Her teacher's instincts kicked in, and she began to see patterns, to understand the educational elements embedded in every aspect of Comanche life. Children learn by observation and participation rather than formal instruction. Skills were passed down through hands-on practice and storytelling. Knowledge was contextual, tied to real-world applications rather than abstract concepts. One evening, as she sat by the fire attempting to improve her moccasin mending skills, a group of children gathered nearby. They had been watching her struggles with obvious amusement for several days, and their presence had become as regular as the evening cooking fires. "White woman sews like baby buffalo," one of the boys announced in English, causing his companions to giggle. Margaret looked up from her crooked stitches and smiled. "You're absolutely right. Would you like to show me how it should be done?" The children exchanged glances, surprised by her request. Adults in their experience didn't usually ask children for instruction, particularly not white adults who were supposed to know everything. A girl of perhaps 10 years stepped forward shyly. "I'll show you," she offered in careful English. "My grandmother taught me." For the next hour, Margaret received her first lesson in proper leatherwork from her young instructor. Little Hawk, as the girl was called, proved to be an excellent teacher, patient and encouraging, while also maintaining high standards. Under her guidance, Margaret's stitches became straighter, stronger, more effective. "Much better," Little Hawk pronounced when Margaret completed a small section under supervision. "You learn like a child learns. Make mistakes, try again, get better." The comment struck Margaret with unexpected force. Here was a 10-year-old Comanche girl who understood intuitively what many adult educators never grasped, that learning was a process of progressive improvement rather than immediate. "Mastery? You're a good teacher," Margaret told her seriously. "Have you thought about what you want to do when you grow up?" Little Hawk's expression grew thoughtful. "I will be a mother like my mother, teach my children the old ways. But—" She hesitated, then continued with the directness Margaret was learning to expect from Comanche children. "Sometimes I wonder about white people's writing marks, how they put words on paper that can be seen by eyes far away." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Here was the opening she had been hoping for, a genuine expression of curiosity about literacy from someone within the community. "Would you like me to show you how the writing marks work?" she offered carefully. Little Hawk glanced around nervously, checking to see if any adults were listening. "Is it magic? Some warriors say white man's writing is dangerous medicine." "It's not magic," Margaret assured her. "It's just a way of making words visible so they can travel far distances or be remembered for a long time, like making a drawing of a buffalo so you can show someone what you saw even when the buffalo is gone." The analogy seemed to resonate with the girl. "Show me," she said quietly. Margaret looked around for something to write with and on. Finding a piece of smooth bark and a charred stick from the fire, she demonstrated the basic concept of written symbols representing spoken sounds. She started with Little Hawk's name, showing how the marks corresponded to the sounds the girl already knew. "These marks say Little Hawk," Margaret explained, "just like if you drew a picture of a small bird, but using agreed-upon symbols instead of pictures." Other children had drifted closer, drawn by curiosity despite their wariness. Margaret found herself conducting an impromptu lesson in basic literacy, using methods she had never tried before, but which seemed to work naturally with her young audience. "Now, when I write your name here," she continued, making the marks again, "anyone who knows these symbols can look at them and know I was thinking about Little Hawk, even if I'm far away or even after I'm gone." The children stared at the marks with fascination and a little fear. The concept of preserving thoughts beyond death clearly had profound implications in their worldview. "Can you write other words?" asked the boy who had initially mocked her. "Sewing. Important words?" Margaret nodded. "Any words? Stories, instructions, descriptions of places, messages between people. That's why I wanted to teach it to children like you, so you could write down your own stories, your own wisdom, in a way that would preserve them forever." The lesson was interrupted by the arrival of Iron Wolf, the young warrior who had challenged Margaret on her first day. His expression was thunderous as he surveyed the scene. A white woman teaching Comanche children the mysterious marks that had been used to create so many deceptive treaties. "What poison do you put in children's minds?" he demanded harshly. The children scattered like startled birds, sensing the anger in his voice, even if they didn't fully understand its source. Margaret stood slowly, the piece of bark still in her hand. "I'm teaching them that knowledge belongs to everyone," she replied calmly, "that they can learn new skills without losing their identity." "Knowledge," Iron Wolf spat. "White man's tricks. To steal more land, make more false promises they write on paper." Margaret understood his anger, even as she felt the sting of his words. She had seen enough broken treaties to know that literacy had indeed been used as a weapon against native peoples, but she also believed deeply in its potential as a tool for empowerment. "Yes, writing has been used to deceive your people," she acknowledged, "but that's exactly why your children need to learn it, so they can read the treaties themselves, understand what they're being asked to agree to, and protect themselves from deception." Iron Wolf's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across his features. He had expected denial or defensive justification, not this calm acknowledgement of historical wrongs. "You admit your people use writing to lie?" "Some do," Margaret replied with her characteristic honesty, "just as some of your people use violence to solve problems that might be solved in other ways. Neither approach represents the best of what humans can be." The young warrior studied her face, searching for signs of hidden agenda or manipulation. "And you think teaching our children white man's marks will make them stronger, not weaker?" "I think teaching them to understand both worlds will make them stronger," Margaret answered. "They don't have to choose between being Comanche and being educated. They can be both." Iron Wolf was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with conflicting thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its edge. "Show me these marks," he said finally. "Show me how they can be used to protect rather than destroy." Margaret felt a surge of hope mixed with trepidation. She was being offered an opportunity to prove her theories, but the stakes were higher than any classroom examination she had ever faced. If she succeeded in demonstrating the protective power of literacy, she might earn genuine acceptance in the community. If she failed, she might confirm the worst suspicions about white education and doom any chance of building the bridges she had come west to construct. As the evening deepened around them, Margaret began her most important lesson yet, teaching a young Comanche warrior that knowledge could be a weapon of defense rather than conquest. and that truth could bridge the gap between two worlds that had forgotten how to speak to each other with anything but violence. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat from a hard ride through the night. Margaret woke to the sound of urgent voices and the rapid gathering of warriors around Swift Eagle's teepee. She had been in the Comanche camp for 6 weeks now, long enough to recognize the signs of crisis in the sudden tension that gripped the community. Singing Bird emerged from the teepee, with her face set in grim lines. "Blue coats come," she announced tersely. 3 days' ride south. They built a soldier fort near the winter campgrounds. Margaret felt her stomach drop. She had feared this moment since her arrival, knowing that her presence in the camp complicated an already volatile situation. Any military action now would be viewed through the lens of her capture, potentially escalating a local conflict into something much larger and more destructive. "How many soldiers?" she asked, her teacher's instinct to gather information overriding her personal fear. "Many," Singing Bird replied grimly. "Too many for direct attack, but they block access to hunting grounds our people need for winter survival." Throughout the morning, heated discussions erupted throughout the camp. Margaret watched from a distance as warriors debated their options, their voices rising and falling with the intensity of their disagreements. She caught fragments of the arguments through her growing understanding of Comanche and the translations provided by Moon Dancing, who had become her closest friend among the women. "Some say we should attack before they finish building," Moon Dancing explained quietly as they worked together preparing hides for the winter. "Strike fast while they are still weak. Others say we should try to negotiate, make a treaty to preserve hunting rights." "What does Swift Eagle think?" Margaret asked. Moon Dancing's expression grew troubled. "He is torn. His heart says fight. He lost 2 brothers to bluecoat bullets last winter, but his head says our people cannot win war against all the soldiers the White Chief can send." As if summoned by their conversation, Swift Eagle approached their work area. His war paint was notably absent, but his expression carried the weight of momentous decisions. He studied Margaret for a long moment before speaking. "White teacher," he said formally, "I have a question for you." Margaret set down her work and faced him directly. Over the past weeks, she had learned that directness was valued in Comanche culture, that attempted diplomacy was often seen as weakness or deception. "Ask your question," she replied. "These soldiers who come, they seek you." The question cut to the heart of Margaret's deepest fears. She had wondered the same thing during sleepless nights, torn between hope for rescue and fear of the consequences. Her presence might bring to people who had shown her unexpected kindness. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "They might be looking for survivors from our mission group, or they might be here for other reasons entirely. Military movements on the frontier often have nothing to do with individual incidents." "Swift," Eagle studied her face carefully. "If they seek you, and we give you to them, they might leave our hunting grounds alone." The words hung in the air between them like a blade. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression calm. This was the moment she had been preparing for since her arrival, the test of whether her commitment to truth extended to situations where honesty might seal her fate. "You're right," she said quietly. "That's possible. If you returned me to the soldiers, they might be satisfied and withdraw from your territory." Surprise flickered across Swift Eagle's features. Most captives would have pleaded for protection or denied any value to their captor's enemies. Margaret's calm acknowledgement of the tactical situation caught him off guard. "You do not beg us to keep you?" he asked. "No," Margaret replied. "I won't lie to save my life or ask you to sacrifice your people's welfare for mine. If returning me to the soldiers is the best way to protect your community, then that's what you should do." A small crowd had gathered to witness this exchange, drawn by the gravity of the discussion. Margaret was aware of their listening ears, their watching eyes, but she focused entirely on Swift Eagle's face. "But," she continued, "I think you should consider all the possibilities before making that decision." "What other possibilities?" Swift Eagle asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. Margaret chose her words carefully, aware that what she said next could determine not only her fate, but the course of the conflict developing around them. Soldiers might be here because someone reported a Comanche raid that resulted in white deaths," she said. "If that's the case, returning me alive proves that you're not mindless killers, that you're capable of mercy and negotiation." She paused, letting that idea settle before continuing. "Or they might be here because the government wants to force you onto a reservation. In that case, having a white woman who can testify to your honorable treatment of prisoners might actually help your cause." Iron Wolf, who had been listening from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward with a skeptical expression. "You think white soldiers care how we treat white captives?" "Some do," Margaret replied honestly. "Not all, but some. There are people in the government who believe in honorable warfare, who distinguish between legitimate military action and wholesale slaughter." "And if we keep you," Swift Eagle asked, "what value do you bring to our people that is worth the risk of soldier anger?" It was the question Margaret had been preparing to answer for weeks, though she had hoped it would come in less desperate circumstances. She looked around at the assembled faces, some curious, some hostile, some genuinely concerned about the decision facing their community. "I can help you navigate the white world that's coming, whether you want it or not," she said. "I can teach your children to read the treaties they'll be asked to sign, to understand the laws that will be imposed on them. I can help preserve your stories and customs in written form so they survive even if everything else changes." She gestured toward Little Hawk, who stood among the children watching the adult drama unfold. "In 6 weeks, that girl has learned to write her own name and read simple words. In 6 months, she could be recording her grandmother's stories, creating a permanent record of Comanche wisdom." "Words on paper," Iron Wolf said dismissively. "What good are they against soldier bullets?" "They're weapons of a different kind," Margaret replied. "When white officials want to justify taking your land, they write reports claiming that Indians are savage and unworthy of consideration. But if your own children can write reports describing your true culture, your actual values, your legitimate claims to these territories, those reports become evidence in your favor." Walking Bear, the peace chief, had been listening quietly from the back of the crowd. Now he moved forward, his aged face thoughtful. "You speak of fighting with words instead of weapons," he observed. "This is woman's way of war." Margaret considered the question seriously. "It's one way of fighting, not the only way, and not always the most effective way. But sometimes it's the only way that leads to victory instead of mutual destruction." "Explain," Walking Bear commanded. Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either convince them of her value or confirm their decision to hand her over to the soldiers. "Your warriors are brave and skilled," she began, "in individual combat, in small raids, in battles where courage and knowledge of the terrain matter most. You can defeat any soldiers, but the white world has advantages you can't match through traditional warfare alone." She paused, making sure she had everyone's attention. "They have more soldiers than you have warriors. They have cannons and repeating rifles. They have supply lines that stretch back to factories that can replace anything you destroy. Most importantly, they have the power to write the official version of events that will be believed by people who make decisions thousands of miles away." Iron Wolf's expression had grown thoughtful, despite his skepticism. "So you think we cannot win through fighting?" "I think you can't win through fighting alone," Margaret corrected. "But if you combine traditional strengths with new tools, if your young people can speak for themselves in the white man's language, if your leaders can negotiate from knowledge rather than ignorance, if your culture can be preserved and defended through written records as well as oral tradition, then you might survive and even thrive. Swift Eagle studied her face intently. And you would teach these things, even knowing that educated Comanche would be more dangerous to white expansion. The question revealed the heart of the dilemma. Margaret was being asked to choose between racial loyalty and the principles that had driven her educational mission. She met Swift Eagle's gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said simply, "because educated people of any heritage make better decisions than ignorant ones, because understanding leads to better solutions than misunderstanding, because I believe that the survival of your people ultimately serves the cause of justice, better than their destruction." The camp fell silent as her words sank in. Margaret had just declared her willingness to arm her captors with the tools of resistance against her own people's expansion. It was either the most foolish statement possible or the most courageous principle. Singing Bird stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "You choose us over your own kind? I choose truth over lies, education over ignorance, and survival over destruction," Margaret replied. "Those aren't choices between people. They're choices between principles." Walking Bear nodded slowly, approval, creeping into his ancient features. "This is wisdom. Woman who chooses principles over tribe loyalty shows strong spirit." Swift Eagle looked around at his gathered people, reading their faces, gauging their reactions. Margaret could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed her potential value against the risks of defying military pressure. "The soldiers will reach our territory in 2 days," he said finally. "By then, I must decide whether to fight them, flee from them, or negotiate with them." His eyes fixed on Margaret. "And whether you will be part of that decision or removed from it." Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "Whatever you decide, I'll accept the consequences. But I hope you'll consider that the choice you make now about how to handle this crisis will shape how your people remember you for generations to come." It was a calculated appeal to Swift Eagle's sense of legacy, and Margaret saw it strike home. In the slight tightening around his eyes, "Would you risk your life on the chance that we choose wisdom over vengeance?" he asked. "I've already risked my life on that chance," Margaret replied. "Every day for 6 weeks. The only difference now is that the stakes are higher and the time is shorter." Swift Eagle was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Margaret to his assembled people and back again. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute decision. 2 days, he repeated. "You will have 2 days to prove that your way of fighting is stronger than the old ways. If the soldiers can be turned away through words and wisdom instead of blood and death, then you will have earned your place among us permanently." Margaret felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. She had been given the chance she had longed for, but at a price that might cost everything if she failed. "And if I fail?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then you will face the consequences of that failure along with the rest of us," Swift Eagle replied grimly. "Comanche do not abandon their teachers, even when those teachers lead them into disaster." As the crowd dispersed to prepare for the challenges ahead, Margaret remained standing in the center of the camp, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had just committed to. In 2 days, she would either prove that education and understanding could triumph over violence and hatred, or she would die alongside the people who had chosen to trust her vision of a different future. The sun climbed higher over the Comanche, camp illuminating a community balanced on the knife's edge between war and peace, between destruction and survival, between the old ways and the new possibilities that a determined teacher from Boston had brought into their midst. Margaret worked through the night by firelight, her fingers moving swiftly across sheets of birch bark as she transcribed the most crucial document of her life. Around her, the Comanche camp buzzed with urgent preparation. Warriors checking weapons, women packing essential belongings in case rapid movement became necessary, children sensing the adult tension and staying close to their mothers. But Margaret's battlefield was different. Armed with charcoal sticks and her knowledge of both languages, she was creating something that had never existed before. A formal proposal written in English, but reflecting genuine Comanche perspectives. A bridge document that could speak to military minds while preserving indigenous dignity. "What words do you put on the speaking bark?" Little Hawk asked, settling beside her despite the late hour. The girl had become Margaret's most devoted student, absorbing literacy with startling speed. "I'm writing a message that might prevent war," Margaret explained, continuing her careful lettering. "I'm telling the soldier chief why your people deserve respect and why fighting would hurt everyone." Little Hawk studied the marks with the intense concentration Margaret had learned to recognize in gifted students. "Can you teach me to write such important words?" Margaret paused in her work, struck by the girl's question. Here was exactly what she had hoped for when she first conceived her educational mission. A young, indigenous mind, eager to master the tools of communication that could protect her people's future. "Would you like to help me write this?" Margaret asked. "Your grandmother knows the old treaties better than anyone. If you could write down what she remembers, it might strengthen our argument." Little Hawk's eyes widened with the gravity of the responsibility, but she nodded firmly. Margaret quickly prepared another piece of bark and began teaching the girl to write key phrases: sacred hunting grounds, winter survival, peaceful coexistence. Within an hour, 3 other children had joined them, drawn by curiosity and the infectious excitement of learning something that adults clearly considered important. Margaret found herself conducting an impromptu literacy workshop under the stars, teaching basic writing skills while simultaneously preparing diplomatic correspondence. "The children learn quickly," observed Walking Bear, approaching their fireside classroom. The old peace chief had been making rounds of the camp, checking preparations and consulting with family heads. "They always do," Margaret replied, watching. 12-year-old Swift Arrow carefully copied treaty language. "Children don't carry the burden of believing that learning something new means betraying something old." Walking Bear settled beside the fire, his weathered face thoughtful. "This morning, Swift Eagle asked me what I thought of your plan to speak with the soldier chief. I told him I have seen many white officials who speak of peace while preparing for war." Margaret set down her charcoal stick and faced him directly. "And what do you think of it now, watching this?" The peace chief gestured toward the children bent over their writing exercises. "Now I think perhaps the real battle is not between soldiers and warriors, but between different ideas of what the future should look like." "Exactly," Margaret said, feeling a surge of hope. "These children are learning to fight with knowledge. Instead of only with weapons, they're preparing to defend their culture in ways their grandparents never could." "But knowledge can be a dangerous weapon," Walking Bear cautioned. "What if they learn to use white man's tools so well that they forget why they learned them?" It was a profound question, one that cut to the heart of Margaret's educational philosophy. She had wrestled with the same concern during her years of preparation, knowing that the line between cultural preservation and cultural assimilation was often thin and easily crossed. "That's why we teach them to write down their own stories first," she explained. "Before they learn to read white man's books, they learn to record their grandmother's wisdom. Before they study white man's laws, they learn to document their own customs and rights." She pointed to Little Hawk, who was now helping a younger child form the letters of his name. "Look at her. She's learning English writing, but she's using it to preserve Comanche knowledge. The tool serves the culture, not the other way around." Walking Bear studied the scene with growing understanding. "You make them strong in both worlds instead of weak in both worlds." "That's the goal," Margaret confirmed. "Children who can navigate white society when necessary, but who never forget where they come from or who they really are. As dawn approached, Iron Wolf appeared at the edge of their workspace. His expression was less hostile than usual, but Margaret could see the tension in his stance, the way his hand unconsciously moved toward his weapon when he looked toward the direction from which the soldiers would come. "Swift Eagle wants to see the words you have prepared," he announced. Margaret gathered the birch bark sheets carefully, her heart hammering with the knowledge that these fragile documents might determine the fate of everyone in the camp. As she followed Iron Wolf toward the chief's teepee, she noticed Little Hawk and the other children trailing behind, their faces bright with the excitement of being part of something momentous. Inside Swift Eagle's dwelling, the War Council had already assembled. The air was thick with tension and the smoke of ceremonial tobacco. Margaret felt the weight of dozens of eyes as she entered, carrying her bark sheets like sacred objects. "Read your words," Swift Eagle commanded, without preamble. Margaret cleared her throat and began to read the letter she had crafted with such care. "To the commanding officer of the United States Forces, I am Margaret Hayes, a teacher who was captured. During a Comanche raid 6 weeks ago, I write to inform you that I have been treated with honor and respect by Chief Swift Eagle and his people, contrary to what you may have been told about savage treatment of prisoners. I have lived among the Comanche and learned their ways. They are not the mindless barbarians described in Eastern newspapers, but sophisticated people with complex laws, rich traditions, and legitimate claims to the lands they have occupied for generations. The current military advance threatens their access to hunting grounds essential for winter survival. This is not a mere inconvenience, but a matter of life and death for their children and elders. I urge you to consider peaceful negotiation before resorting to violence that will inevitably lead to casualties on both sides. I volunteer to serve as an intermediary in any discussions you might be willing to undertake. As a white woman who has gained their trust through honest dealing, I may be able to facilitate communication that could prevent unnecessary bloodshed. If you doubt my sincerity or my freedom to write this letter, I invite you to meet with me personally. I will speak only the truth about what I have witnessed here, whether that truth serves military convenience or not." As Margaret finished reading, the teepee fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. She could feel the weight of judgment from every man present, knowing that her words would either open a path to peace or condemn them all to a conflict they could not win. "Strong words," Swift Eagle said finally, "words that could anger a soldier chief if he thinks you have been turned against your own people." "Then he would be wrong," Margaret replied firmly. "I haven't been turned against anyone. I've been turned toward truth and justice, which should serve everyone's interests." Iron Wolf leaned forward, his expression intense. "You really believe White Soldier Chief will listen to such words, will consider Comanche needs before his orders?" Margaret met his gaze honestly. "I don't know. Some will, some won't. But this letter gives him a choice he might not have considered. Otherwise, it shows him that there are alternatives to conquest and massacre." "And if he chooses conquest anyway?" asked Stone Bear, one of the elder warriors. "Then at least we will have tried the path of honor first," Margaret replied. "Your children will know that their fathers sought peace before they made war. History will record that the Comanche offered negotiation before they were forced to defend themselves." Walking Bear nodded approvingly. "This is wisdom. Better to fight from moral strength than from desperation alone." Swift Eagle studied the bark sheets in Margaret's hands, then looked around at his assembled counselors. "Who will carry this message to the soldier chief?" "I will," Margaret said immediately. "It should come from me personally. A letter alone might be ignored or misunderstood." "Too dangerous," Iron Wolf objected. "If soldiers think you have been corrupted by living among us, they might punish you or use you as an excuse to attack immediately." Margaret appreciated his concern, but she had already considered and accepted the risks. Someone has to take the chance. If I don't go, who else can speak for your people in a language the soldiers will understand? What if they keep you? Singing Bird asked, voicing the fear that several faces reflected. What if they refuse to let you return? It was a possibility Margaret had wrestled with through the sleepless night. She had grown attached to these people in ways that surprised her, had found purpose and meaning in this harsh life that her comfortable Boston existence had never provided. The thought of permanent separation from Little Hawk and the other children she was teaching caused genuine pain. "Then you'll know I tried," she said simply, "and you'll have the skills I've taught you to continue building bridges with the next white officials you encounter." Swift Eagle stood abruptly, moving to the tippy entrance and gazing out at the lightening sky. The deadline he had set was approaching rapidly, and with it, the moment when words would either triumph over weapons or prove themselves inadequate to prevent catastrophe. "If you go to the soldiers," he said without turning around, "you go as more than a prisoner returning to her people. You go as the voice of the Comanche, speaking our truth to those who have power over our future." The significance of his words struck Margaret like a physical blow. He was offering her something unprecedented, not just freedom to leave, but authority to represent the tribe in negotiations that could determine their survival. "I understand the honor you're giving me," she said quietly. "I won't abuse it." Swift Eagle turned back to face her, his expression grave. "You also understand the danger. If soldiers think you speak for us, they may blame us for words that anger them." "They may," Margaret agreed, "but they may also respect us for words that show wisdom and strength." The war chief studied her face. One final time, searching for any hint of doubt or hidden agenda, finding none, he nodded decisively. "You will go at first light. Iron Wolf will escort you to within sight of the soldier camp, then return with their answer." He paused, his voice carrying unexpected emotion. "If you do not return, we will remember that a white teacher chose to risk her life for Comanche children." As the council dispersed to make final preparations, Margaret felt the full weight of her transformed identity settling around her like a new skin. She was no longer Margaret Hayes, a captured missionary from Boston. She had become something entirely new, a cultural translator, a bridge between worlds, a voice for the voiceless. Outside the teepee, Little Hawk waited with the other children who had participated in the night's writing lesson. In their hands, they held pieces of bark covered with their own carefully formed letters. "We wrote messages too," Little Hawk announced proudly, "to tell the soldier chief that Comanche children are learning white man's writing, but keeping Comanche in their hearts." Margaret knelt to examine their work, her throat tight with emotion. These children had grasped the essence of her mission more clearly than many adults. They understood that knowledge was a tool, not a master, and that they could use it to strengthen rather than abandon their cultural identity. "These are perfect," she told them, meaning every word. "When I speak to the soldier chief, I'll tell him about children who are building bridges between two worlds instead of walls." As the sun climbed over the eastern hills, Margaret prepared for the most important journey of her life. Armed with bark letters and hard-won wisdom, she would soon discover whether the bonds she had forged with the Comanche were strong enough to prevent a war, and whether the truth she had always served would prove powerful enough to transform enemies into allies. The military camp sprawled across the valley floor like a geometric scar on the landscape, its rigid lines and uniform tents a stark contrast to the organic curves of the Comanche settlement hidden in the hills above. Margaret crouched behind a cluster of boulders with Iron Wolf, studying the scene below through the early morning haze. "Many soldiers," Iron Wolf observed grimly. "More than Swift Eagle expected." Margaret counted the tents systematically, her Teacher's mind automatically cataloging and organizing information. At least 2 companies, maybe 3. That's over 200 men. She paused, noting the artillery pieces positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. They're not here just to patrol. This is preparation for a major campaign. Iron Wolf's jaw tightened as he absorbed the implications. They plan to drive all tribes from these lands, not just negotiate for hunting rights. Maybe, Margaret replied, carefully. Or maybe they're showing strength to encourage negotiation from a position of power. Military commanders often prefer to speak from positions they feel are unassailable. The young warrior studied her face with something approaching respect. Over the past weeks, he had grown to appreciate her ability to see multiple possibilities where others saw only the obvious interpretation. "You still believe talking can work against so many guns?" he asked. Margaret looked down at the birch bark letters in her hands, then back at the intimidating military display below. "I believe it's the only thing that can work. If this becomes a shooting war, your people will be wiped out. But if we can make them see you as humans rather than obstacles, there might be a path to coexistence." Iron Wolf nodded slowly, then pointed toward a large tent at the center of the camp, distinguished by the flag flying above it. "Officer Lodge. That's where you must go." Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. "Remember, wait until sunset. If I haven't returned by then, assume the worst and get back to Swift Eagle. And if you do not return," Iron Wolf asked, "then tell the children to keep practicing their writing," Margaret said with a sad smile. "Tell them that knowledge will outlast all of us." The descent to the valley floor took longer than expected, partly because Margaret had to move carefully through terrain she didn't know well, but mostly because she needed time to prepare mentally for the most crucial conversation of her life. Everything she had learned about the Comanche, everything she believed about education and understanding, everything she hoped for the future of both peoples would be tested in the next few hours. The sentries spotted her long before she reached the camp perimeter. She saw them snap to attention, rifles raised, voices calling out challenges and warnings. Margaret raised her hands above her head and continued walking steadily forward, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger a shooting that would doom all hopes for peaceful resolution. "I am Margaret Hayes," she called out when she was close, enough to be heard clearly. "I was captured 6 weeks ago from the missionary party that was attacked in Devil's Canyon. I have a message for your commanding officer." The soldiers exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for this development. After a brief consultation, one of them approached her cautiously, while the others maintained their weapons training on her. "Mrs. Hayes?" the soldier asked incredulously. "We heard you were dead. How did you survive? How did you escape?" "I survived because the Comanche chose to let me live," Margaret replied honestly. "And I didn't escape. I came here voluntarily to prevent a war that will cost lives on both sides." The soldier's confusion was evident. In his experience, captives either escaped or were rescued. The idea of voluntary negotiation between enemies was outside his frame of reference. "I need to see your commanding officer immediately," Margaret continued. "I have information that could prevent unnecessary bloodshed, but time is running short." Within minutes, Margaret found herself escorted through the camp toward the command tent, acutely aware of the stares and whispered comments from soldiers who had assumed they were marching against savages who had murdered all the white civilians in their territory. Her presence complicated that narrative in ways that would require significant adjustment of their preconceptions. Colonel William Harrison emerged from his tent as Margaret approached, his weathered face showing surprise and skepticism in equal measure. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, but still carrying the weight of decisions that affected hundreds of lives. "Mrs. Hayes, I presume," he said formally. I am Colonel Harrison, commanding this expedition. My condolences on the loss of your husband and companions. We were told there were no survivors. Thank you, Colonel, Margaret replied with equal formality. And there were no survivors of the attack itself, but the Comanche chose to spare my life, and I have spent the past 6 weeks living among them. Harrison's eyebrows rose sharply. Living among them? As a prisoner? Initially, yes, but my status has evolved considerably. Margaret held out the birch-bark letters. I've come to deliver a formal communication from Chief Swift Eagle, along with my own observations about the situation we're all facing. The colonel accepted the documents with obvious bewilderment. Documents written on bark. Paper is scarce on the frontier, Margaret explained. But the content matters more than the medium. Chief Swift Eagle has authorized me to speak on behalf of his people in any negotiations you might be willing to consider. Harrison gestured toward his tent. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. Inside the command tent, maps covered a folding table, showing the surrounding territory with military precision. Margaret noted the areas marked in red, presumably indicating Comanche presence, and the blue arrows showing planned troop movements. It was clear that Colonel Harrison had been preparing for a comprehensive campaign to clear the region of native resistance. Mrs. Hayes, Harrison began, settling into a camp chair and gesturing for her to do the same. I must ask you directly, have you been coerced in any way to deliver this message? Are you here under duress? Margaret appreciated the question, understanding that he needed to establish her mental state and freedom of choice before taking her words seriously. No coercion, she replied firmly. I came here because I believe both sides are about to make a terrible mistake that will cost hundreds of lives and solve nothing. I've seen enough of war's aftermath to know that victory through massacre isn't really victory at all. Harrison studied her face carefully. You mentioned observations about the situation. What have you learned during your time among the Comanche? Margaret chose her words carefully, knowing that her credibility would determine whether her message received serious consideration. I learned that they're not the savage barbarians described in Eastern newspapers, she began. They have complex social structures, sophisticated knowledge of this environment, and legitimate grievances against white expansion that has consistently broken promises and stolen their resources. The colonel's expression remained neutral, but Margaret sensed his attention sharpening. Go on. I also learned that they're not interested in exterminating white settlers, she continued. They want access to their traditional hunting grounds and respect for their right to exist as a people. Chief Swift Eagle specifically authorized me to explore possibilities for peaceful coexistence. Harrison unfolded one of the bark letters and began reading, his expression growing more serious as he absorbed the content. Margaret watched his face for signs of how her carefully crafted words were being received. This is not what I expected, he admitted, after finishing the first letter. The language is surprisingly sophisticated. You wrote this? I wrote the English version, but the ideas and specific proposals came from extensive discussions with Chief Swift Eagle and his council, Margaret explained. I served as translator, not author. The colonel picked up the second letter, this one containing the children's messages, as he read the careful lettering and simple but heartfelt words about learning and peace. His expression softened noticeably. Comanche children wrote these. Yes, I've been teaching basic literacy to several of them. They wanted to show you that they're capable of learning what you might call civilized skills, while remaining proud of their heritage. Harrison set down the letters and leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with his preconceptions about the mission he had been sent to accomplish. Mrs. Hayes, I was ordered to secure this territory for white settlement and to neutralize any Indian resistance by whatever means necessary. These letters suggest possibilities I hadn't considered. What possibilities? Margaret asked, sensing an opening. The possibility that negotiation might accomplish more than force, Harrison replied slowly. The possibility that these people might be willing to coexist rather than fight to the death. Margaret felt a surge of hope, but she was careful not to appear too eager. Chief Swift Eagle specifically asked me to explore what coexistence might look like. He's not naive about the power balance, but he's willing to consider arrangements that preserve his people's dignity while acknowledging the reality of American expansion. Harrison stood and moved to the map table, studying the terrain markers with new eyes. What kind of arrangements? Margaret joined him at the table, pointing to areas she had learned about during her time with the Comanche, limited territorial rights that include access to seasonal hunting grounds, educational opportunities for their children that preserve cultural identity while providing practical skills, trade relationships that benefit both communities, and in exchange, peaceful relations with white settlements. Cooperation in preventing raids by other tribes, assistance in navigating this territory safely. Margaret paused, then added the crucial element. And legitimacy in the eyes of Washington. Your report to higher authorities could either justify extermination or support a model for peaceful integration that could be applied throughout the frontier. The colonel was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the implications of what she was proposing. When he spoke, his voice carried the burden of command decisions that would echo through history. You understand that this deviates significantly from my orders? I understand that following your orders as written would result in a massacre that history will judge harshly, Margaret replied with her characteristic directness. I also understand that demonstrating successful negotiation with a supposedly hostile tribe could advance your career more than conventional military victory. Harrison's eyes sharpened with interest. Explain. Washington is growing tired of expensive Indian wars that drag on for years and consume enormous resources, Margaret said, drawing on her knowledge of Eastern politics. An officer who can achieve peace through diplomacy rather than force would be seen as exactly the kind of innovative leader the army needs. She gestured toward the letters on his desk. These documents prove that you had genuine communication with Comanche leadership, that you explored all options before resorting to violence. Whether you ultimately choose war or peace, your superiors will see that you acted with intelligence and consideration. The colonel picked up one of the children's letters again, reading the carefully formed words. We learn white man's writing, but keep Comanche hearts. We want peace between all children. These children, he said slowly, you really believe they can bridge both worlds successfully? I know they can, Margaret replied with absolute conviction. I've watched them absorb new knowledge while strengthening their connection to traditional wisdom. They're proof that education can unite rather than divide. Harrison moved back to his chair, his decision-making process clearly intense. If I were to arrange a meeting between Chief Swift Eagle and myself, could you guarantee safe passage for my negotiating party? Margaret felt her pulse quicken. I can guarantee that Swift Eagle will honor any agreement we make. But I should warn you that not all his warriors support negotiation. There are those who believe that war is inevitable and should be fought sooner rather than later. The same could be said of my command, Harrison admitted. Many of my officers were looking forward to decisive action against hostile Indians. They may not appreciate it. Alternative approaches. Then we're both taking risks, Margaret observed. The question is whether the potential benefits justify those risks. The colonel stood abruptly, his decision made. Arrange the meeting. Tomorrow at noon, At the neutral ground where Devil's Canyon opens into the valley, I'll bring 5 men, no more. Chief Swift Eagle can bring equal numbers." Margaret felt a mixture of elation and terror as the magnitude of what they were attempting settled over her. "And if the negotiations fail, then we'll both know we tried the honorable path first," Harrison replied, echoing words Margaret had heard from Walking Bear. "Sometimes that's the most we can do." As Margaret prepared to return to the Comanche camp with news of the agreed meeting, she realized that her journey from captured missionary to diplomatic negotiator was about to reach its climax. Tomorrow would determine whether her faith in education and understanding was justified, or whether the forces of hatred and fear would prove too strong to overcome. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon as she left the military camp, carrying with her the fragile hope that words might yet prove stronger than weapons, and that truth might finally triumph over the comfortable lies that had fueled so much frontier violence. The neutral ground at Devil's Canyon mouth stretched between two worlds like a stage set for history. Margaret stood at the exact center of the space, her heart hammering as she watched both parties approach from opposite directions. To the east, Colonel Harrison rode with 5 mounted officers, their uniforms crisp despite the frontier dust, their weapons visible but not drawn. From the west, Swift Eagle approached with his own carefully chosen delegation, Walking Bear for wisdom, Iron Wolf for the warrior perspective, Singing Bird representing the Women's Council, and Stone Bear as witness to whatever agreements might be forged. The irony was not lost on Margaret that she stood in the same canyon where her missionary journey had ended in violence 7 weeks earlier. Now she prayed that this same ground might witness the beginning of understanding rather than the continuation of bloodshed. Both groups reined in their horses 20 yards apart, creating a space that felt charged with the weight of centuries of conflict. Margaret walked slowly toward Colonel Harrison's party, her movements deliberate and calm, despite the trembling in her hands. "Colonel Harrison," she said formally, "may I present Chief Swift Eagle of the Red River Comanche, Peace Chief Walking Bear, War Leader Iron Wolf, Women's Council Representative Singing Bird, and Witness Stone Bear." She turned to the Comanche delegation. "Chief Swift Eagle, may I present Colonel William Harrison, commanding officer of the territorial forces, and his staff officers." The formal introductions completed, an awkward silence settled over the group. Margaret realized that her role as intermediary was just beginning. These men had spent their adult lives preparing to kill each other. Learning to speak to each other would require skills none of them had ever needed to develop. "Chief Swift Eagle," she began, "Colonel Harrison has read your letters and is particularly interested in your proposals regarding territorial boundaries and seasonal hunting rights." Swift Eagle nodded gravely and spoke in Comanche, his words measured and dignified. Margaret translated, "Chief Swift Eagle says that his people have lived on these lands since his grandfather's grandfather's time. They do not understand how distant chiefs in Washington can sell what was never theirs to own." Colonel Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "The legal framework of territorial acquisition is complex," he replied diplomatically, "but I'm more interested in practical solutions that serve everyone's needs." When Margaret translated this, Walking Bear leaned forward and spoke at length, gesturing toward the canyon walls and the distant mountains. Margaret listened carefully, then turned back to Harrison. "Peace Chief Walking Bear says that white men speak of ownership as if land were a horse or a blanket that can be possessed by one person. But land is like water or air. It belongs to all who need it to live. He asks if there is a way to share rather than divide." The colonel considered this carefully. "What kind of sharing does he envision?" Swift Eagle answered directly in English this time, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "Comanche keep hunting grounds for winter meat, sacred places for ceremonies. White settlers take farming lands, build towns where the game is already gone. Both peoples benefit, neither starve. And conflicts between your people and white settlers? Harrison asked. Iron Wolf spoke for the first time, his voice harsh with remembered pain. Margaret translated his rapid Comanche. War leader Iron Wolf says that most conflicts come from misunderstanding. White settlers shoot Indians they think are raiders. Indians attack white men they think are soldiers. Fear makes enemies where there should be none. Margaret paused, then added her own interpretation. What he's describing is essentially a communication problem. Both sides react to perceived threats that might not be real threats at all. Colonel Harrison nodded thoughtfully. And you believe education could address these communication problems? I know it can, Margaret replied with conviction. In the past 7 weeks, I've taught Comanche children to read and write English. They've taught me to understand their customs and perspectives. Every lesson has reduced fear and increased understanding on both sides. Singing Bird spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of motherhood and cultural wisdom. Margaret translated, Singing Bird says that mothers on both sides want the same things: safety for their children, food for their families, hope for the future. She asks why men cannot find ways to give mothers what they need instead of giving them reasons to mourn. The power of this simple question struck both military officers and Comanche warriors with equal force. Several long moments passed before Colonel Harrison responded, She's right, of course, but the practical challenges are enormous. How do we establish trust between communities that have been at war? How do we prevent future conflicts when emotions run so high on both sides? Swift Eagle and Walking Bear conferred briefly in Comanche. Then Swift Eagle addressed the colonel. Directly, we propose a test. Small area first, maybe one valley, one season. Comanche families and white families share land, trade goods, and learn together. If it works, expand. If it fails, he shrugged. Then we know peace is not possible. Margaret felt her breath catch at the audacity of the proposal. Chief Swift Eagle is suggesting a pilot program, a controlled experiment in coexistence that could serve as a model for larger agreements. The military implications were immediately apparent to Harrison. A successful demonstration of peaceful coexistence would be enormously valuable to territorial authorities. It could change the entire approach to frontier policy. And an unsuccessful demonstration? Asked one of Harrison's officers, a captain whose skepticism was evident in his tone. Iron Wolf understood enough English to catch the meaning. He spoke directly to the captain, his words clipped but clear. If peace fails, war comes anyway. We lose nothing by trying first. Margaret watched the faces around her as the logic of this argument sank in. Everyone present understood that the current trajectory led inevitably to violence that would cost hundreds of lives and solve nothing. The proposed experiment offered a chance to break that cycle, even if success was far from guaranteed. What specific arrangements would this experiment involve? Colonel Harrison asked. Over the next 2 hours, the details gradually took shape. A valley 20 miles north would serve as the test area, with equal numbers of Comanche and white families establishing adjacent settlements. Shared resources would include water rights, seasonal hunting access, and trade opportunities. Educational programs would operate in both communities, with Comanche children learning English literacy and white children learning indigenous knowledge of local ecology and survival skills. The school, Margaret interjected during a discussion, of educational arrangements. It should serve both communities equally. No forced assimilation, no cultural destruction. The goal is to create bilingual, bicultural children who can serve as bridges between worlds. Walking Bear nodded approvingly and spoke in Comanche. Margaret smiled as she translated. Peace Chief Walking Bear says that children who belong to both worlds will never let those worlds destroy each other. As the afternoon wore on, the initial stiffness between the negotiating parties gradually relaxed. Margaret found herself facilitating not just translation, but genuine communication, watching suspicions slowly give way to cautious respect. When Stonebear offered jerky to Colonel Harrison's men, and when the colonel shared water from his canteen with the Comanche delegation, she realized that symbolic barriers were beginning to fall. The breakthrough moment came when Little Hawk appeared at the edge of the meeting ground, accompanied by Moon Dancing and 3 other Comanche children. They approached shyly, carrying pieces of birch bark covered with carefully formed letters. "My students wanted to present their work to Colonel Harrison personally," Margaret explained, as the children lined up nervously. Little Hawk stepped forward. First, her young voice clear as she read in halting English, "Dear Soldier Chief, we are Comanche children, learning white man's writing. We write our grandmother's stories so they will not be lost. We want to learn your stories too. Maybe children's friendship can teach grown-ups how to be friends." The impact on the assembled adults was immediate and profound. Colonel Harrison dismounted and knelt to Little Hawk's level, accepting the bark paper with evident emotion. "This is remarkable," he said softly. "How long have you been learning to write?" 6 weeks, Little Hawk replied proudly. "Teacher Margaret says words on paper can travel far and can last a long time. I want my children to know grandmother's wisdom and also know white people's knowledge." One of Harrison's officers, a young lieutenant who had been openly skeptical about the negotiations, stared at the children with obvious amazement. "They're just children," he said unnecessarily. "They could be any children, anywhere." "Exactly," Margaret said quietly. "Strip away the fear and prejudice, and you find that human needs and dreams are remarkably similar, regardless of heritage." Swift Eagle watched the interaction between his tribal children and the white soldiers, with expressions ranging from pride to amazement. When the children finished their presentations and were praised by the military officers, he spoke directly to Colonel Harrison in his careful English. "You see now why we fight for peace instead of war. These children are our future. They must have a world where being both Comanche and educated is possible." Colonel Harrison stood slowly, his decision-making process clearly complete. "Chief Swift Eagle, I am prepared to recommend this experimental arrangement to my superiors. More than that, I'm prepared to stake my career on its success." The formal agreement was drafted on proper paper that Harrison provided, with copies in both English and Comanche pictographs that Walking Bear created. Margaret served as witness and translator, as both leaders signed their names to a document that represented a revolutionary departure from frontier policy. As the sun began to set over Devil's Canyon, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson, the 2 delegations prepared to part, but the atmosphere had transformed completely from the morning's tension. Officers and warriors shook hands with genuine respect. Singing Bird presented Colonel Harrison with a beaded medallion as a token of peaceful intentions. The colonel, in turn, gave Swift Eagle his personal compass as a symbol of finding new directions. "Mrs. Hayes," Colonel Harrison said as the groups prepared to separate, "I must ask what your plans are now. You're welcome to return to civilization, of course. Your brother in San Francisco has been notified of your survival and is arranging transport." Margaret looked around at the Comanche delegation, at the children who had become her students, at the adults who had accepted her as family. Then she looked back at the colonel with a smile that held no uncertainty. "My plans are to continue my work here," she said firmly. "The school we discussed will need a teacher who understands both worlds. The peace we've negotiated will need people who can translate not just languages, but entire ways of thinking." Swift Eagle nodded approvingly. "Teacher Margaret has chosen. She is Comanche now, but also still white woman. She speaks truth to both peoples." Iron Wolf, who had been Margaret's sternest critic in the early weeks, stepped forward with an expression of grudging respect. "You proved strong medicine," he said in English. "Words on paper medicine is stronger than war medicine." As the military column rode back toward their camp and the Comanche party prepared to return to their village, Margaret felt the weight of history settling around her accomplishment. She had not only survived capture and cultural displacement, but had transformed both experiences into tools for building the bridges she had originally come west to create. The experimental valley settlement was established within a month, with families from both communities volunteering for the challenging work of pioneering peaceful coexistence. Margaret's school became the heart of the community, with Comanche and white children learning side by side, absorbing both traditional wisdom and academic skills. The success of the project attracted attention from Washington, leading to congressional hearings where Margaret testified about the potential for peaceful frontier development. Her written accounts of Comanche culture, based on her intimate knowledge of their society, influenced federal policy for decades and helped preserve traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Little Hawk grew up to become the first Comanche woman to graduate from a territorial university, returning to serve as a translator and cultural ambassador between worlds. Moondancing's son became a renowned physician who combined traditional healing methods with modern medical knowledge. Iron Wolf eventually served as a liaison between the army and various tribal groups, using his warrior skills to prevent conflicts rather than wage them. Colonel Harrison's career advanced rapidly, with his successful negotiation serving as a model for peaceful frontier development. He and Margaret maintained a lifelong correspondence, collaborating on policies that respected indigenous rights while accommodating territorial expansion. Years later, when Margaret was an old woman with silver hair and hands still stained with ink from her constant writing, she would sit by the fire in the evening and tell stories to her grandchildren, some biological, some adopted, all cherished equally. The children gathered around her feet came from various heritages: Comanche, white, mixed blood, and occasionally other tribes whose families had joined the experimental community. "Tell us again about the day you choose truth over safety," Little Hawk's daughter would request, her eyes bright with the same intelligence that had characterized her mother, and Margaret would begin the story, as she always did. "Truth is not always convenient, little one. Sometimes it demands that we risk everything we think we want for something we know is right. But I learned that speaking truth, even when your voice shakes, even when your heart pounds with fear, is the only way to build a world where all children can thrive." The experimental valley had grown into a thriving community of nearly 1,000 souls, representing a dozen different cultural backgrounds, united by shared commitment to understanding rather than conquest. Margaret's school had expanded into a regional center of learning, famous throughout the territory for producing graduates who could navigate multiple worlds with confidence and dignity. When Margaret died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by students and family members who spanned multiple generations and cultures, her funeral was attended by territorial governors, tribal chiefs, army officers, and hundreds of ordinary people whose lives had been touched by her unwavering commitment to truth and education. The school she founded continued to operate for over 50 years, finally closing only when the frontier era ended, and such specialized institutions were no longer needed. But its graduates carried her legacy forward, becoming teachers, doctors, lawyers, farmers, artists, and leaders who remembered that strength came not from choosing sides, but from building bridges. Margaret's journals, carefully preserved by her, students eventually found their way to university libraries, where they served as primary sources for historians studying the frontier period. But more importantly, they served as inspiration for educators who face the challenge of teaching across cultural divides, proving that respect and understanding could triumph over fear and prejudice when wielded by people brave enough to speak. Truth in the face of overwhelming opposition. The marker placed over Margaret's grave bore a simple inscription in both English and Comanche. She spoke truth to all peoples and taught us that knowledge belongs to everyone. But perhaps the most fitting memorial was the annual gathering of her former students and their descendants, who would meet each year at Devil's Canyon to share stories, exchange knowledge, and remember that even in the darkest times, individual courage could light the way toward a more hopeful future. The woman who had begun her journey as a captured missionary had become something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds, a voice for the voiceless, and proof that education guided by truth and compassion could transform enemies into family. Her legacy lived on not in monuments or official honors, but in the countless lives she had touched and the enduring example she had set of what one person could accomplish when they chose principle over prejudice, understanding over ignorance, and hope over despair. 3 decades after the Devil's Canyon Agreement, when the Transcontinental Railroad finally reached the territory, Margaret stood on the platform, watching the first locomotive steam into the valley. The sight stirred complex emotions: pride in the progress her community had achieved, concern about what rapid change might bring, and deep satisfaction in seeing her former students among the crowd of officials and dignitaries who had come to witness this historic moment. James Crawford, formerly known as Swift Arrow, now served as the Valley's elected representative to the territorial legislature. His bilingual education had equipped him to navigate the complex legal frameworks that governed the transition from frontier territory to formal statehood. Beside him stood Dr. Sarah Whitehorse, a mixed-heritage physician whose medical practice combined traditional healing methods with the latest advances from Eastern medical schools. Teacher Margaret. James approached her through the crowd, his formal manner barely concealing the warmth of genuine affection. "The governor wants to present you with a commendation for your contributions to territorial development." Margaret smiled, noting how naturally he switched between English formality and the more personal communication style they had developed during his childhood education. "You know, I've never been comfortable with public recognition, James. My work speaks for itself, which is exactly why you deserve recognition," Dr. Whitehorse interjected, joining their conversation. "Your methods have been studied by educators from California to New York. The Harvard Educational Review published 3 articles about your integrated curriculum approach." The recognition was gratifying, but Margaret's attention was drawn to a more significant sight: clusters of children from various backgrounds playing together near the train platform. Their easy interactions, a testament to how thoroughly normalized cultural integration had become in their community. These third-generation students barely noticed the ethnic differences that had once seemed insurmountable to their grandparents. Later that evening, as the excitement of the railroad's arrival settled into quiet reflection, Margaret found herself in her study, surrounded by decades of accumulated correspondence. Letters from former students who had become teachers, doctors, lawyers, and community leaders across the expanding territory. Reports from other experimental communities that had adopted variations of her educational model. Academic papers analyzing the sociological implications of successful cultural integration. One letter, received just the previous week, particularly moved her. It came from Rebecca Thompson, a white woman who had married into a Navajo family and was establishing a similar integrated school in Arizona Territory. "Dear Mrs. Hayes, your example has shown us that the conventional wisdom about cultural assimilation is not only wrong, but actively harmful. The children in our community who learn both Apache and English, who study both traditional ecological knowledge and European mathematics, who understand both indigenous spiritual practices and Christian theology, are not confused or conflicted as critics predicted. They are stronger, more adaptable, more capable of solving complex problems than children educated in single-culture environments. Your pioneering work has given us the courage to challenge established assumptions and create something better. Such letters arrived regularly now, as word of the Valley's success spread throughout the frontier regions. Margaret had become, almost accidentally, a leading figure in educational reform, though she remained focused on the daily work of teaching. Rather than seeking broader influence, a soft knock on her study door interrupted her reading. "Come in," she called, expecting one of her household members. Instead, Colonel Harrison entered, his hair now completely grey, but his bearing still military straight. He had retired from active service 5 years earlier and had moved to the Valley to serve as Superintendent of Regional Development, overseeing the careful integration of new settlers with established communities. "Working late again, I see," he observed, settling into the chair opposite her desk. "Some things never change." "The correspondence keeps growing," Margaret replied, gesturing at the stacks of letters. "It seems every territory west of the Mississippi wants advice on establishing integrated communities." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "I've been receiving similar requests from military commanders. The War Department is finally beginning to understand that peaceful coexistence is more cost-effective than continuous warfare." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two old friends who had shared the responsibility of creating something unprecedented. Their friendship had deepened over the years, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the principles they had fought to establish. "I have news," Harrison said finally. "The President has signed the legislation creating Colorado Territory. Our valley will be one of the founding districts." Margaret felt a surge of pride mixed with apprehension. Statehood brought opportunities, but also challenges, particularly regarding the legal status of integrated communities that existed somewhat outside conventional territorial governance structures. "What does that mean for our special agreements?" she asked. "The territorial constitution includes specific provisions protecting integrated communities and guaranteeing educational autonomy," Harrison replied with satisfaction. "Your former students who are now serving in the territorial government made sure of that." The conversation turned to practical matters: how statehood would affect land rights, educational funding, and the legal framework that had allowed their experiment to flourish. But Margaret's mind drifted to larger questions about legacy and continuity. "William," she said, using his first name as she did only in private conversation, "do you ever wonder whether what we've built here can survive? The change is coming. The railroad brings opportunities, but it also brings people who may not share our values." Harrison considered her question seriously. "I think the real test isn't whether our specific community survives unchanged, but whether the principles we've demonstrated can be adapted to new circumstances. The children you've educated understand that diversity is a strength rather than a threat. They'll carry that understanding wherever they go." As if summoned by their conversation, voices could be heard from the front of the house. Young people, arriving for the weekly evening discussion group that met in Margaret's parlor. These gatherings had evolved organically from her original literacy classes into forums where community members of all ages explored complex questions about identity, governance, and social change. "Sounds like tonight's discussion is beginning," Harrison observed. "What's the topic?" Margaret smiled. "The ethics of progress." The students wanted to discuss whether technological advancement inevitably requires cultural homogenization, or whether diversity can be preserved while embracing beneficial changes. Sophisticated question for young people to tackle. They're sophisticated young people, Margaret replied with pride. They've grown up navigating multiple cultural frameworks. They understand complexity in ways that single-culture education rarely produces. As they moved toward the parlor, Margaret reflected on how these evening discussions had become a laboratory for democratic discourse. Young people who might have been enemies in their grandparents' generation now collaborated on addressing the challenges facing their rapidly changing world. The parlor buzzed with animated conversation as nearly 20 young adults debated questions that would have been incomprehensible to previous generations. Maria Santos, whose grandparents had fled violence in Mexico, argued with passionate eloquence about the importance of preserving linguistic diversity. Thomas Blackbear, the son of a Cheyenne mother and white father, challenged assumptions about economic development. Rebecca Harrison, the colonel's niece, who had come west for her education, facilitated discussions with skills that would serve her well in the territorial legislature she planned to join. Teacher Margaret, called out David Littlefoot, now a practicing attorney who had studied at both tribal councils and territorial courts. We need you to settle an argument about land use rights. Margaret laughed. You know I don't settle arguments. I help people discover better questions to ask. Then help us discover better questions about whether individual property rights can coexist with traditional collective land management. It was exactly the kind of complex issue that their community had been grappling with for decades, and Margaret felt a familiar thrill at the intellectual challenge. These young people were wrestling with questions that would shape the future of the American West, and they were approaching those questions with frameworks that no previous generation had possessed. The discussion continued late into the evening, ranging across topics from voting rights for women and indigenous peoples to the environmental impact of industrial development. Margaret listened more than she spoke, observing how her former students had internalized the critical thinking skills she had worked so hard to develop. As the gathering finally dispersed near midnight, several participants lingered to continue individual conversations. Margaret noticed Rebecca Harrison deep in discussion with Joseph Singing Wolf about collaborative approaches to territorial governance, while Maria Santos and Thomas Blackbear planned a joint presentation to the Territorial Education Committee about multilingual instruction methods. You've created something remarkable here, Colonel Harrison observed as they watched the young people gradually depart. These aren't just educated individuals, they're architects of a new kind of society. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of satisfaction that came from work well done. They understand that identity doesn't have to be exclusive, that strength comes from synthesis rather than purity. Most importantly, they know that truth is more powerful than convenient fiction. The following morning brought news that underscored the significance of the changes sweeping through the territory. A telegram arrived announcing that Little Hawk, now known professionally as Dr. Catherine Hawthorne, had been appointed to the faculty of the Territorial University as the first Native American professor in the institution's history. Margaret read the telegram with tears of pride, remembering the shy 10-year-old who had first asked to learn the white man's writing marks. That curious child had grown into a distinguished scholar whose research on traditional ecological knowledge was reshaping academic understanding of indigenous science. The appointment represented more than individual achievement. It symbolized the complete transformation of what had once seemed like an unbridgeable divide between cultures. A Comanche woman would now teach white students, sharing traditional knowledge through academic frameworks while maintaining her cultural identity and connections to her tribal community. That afternoon, Margaret received visitors who reinforced her growing sense that the work begun in Devil's Canyon was reaching far beyond their small valley. A delegation from the Department of Indian Affairs had come to study their integration model for possible implementation in other territories. Mrs. Hayes, The delegation leader introduced himself as Assistant Secretary Morrison. "We've read your reports and observed the outcomes of your educational approach. The department is interested in scaling your methods to address conflicts in other regions." Margaret invited the officials into her study, noting their genuine interest in understanding rather than simply copying her work. "The specific methods matter less than the underlying principles," she began. "Respect for cultural heritage, commitment to bilingual education, emphasis on critical thinking rather than rote learning, and absolute honesty about historical injustices." "That last point concerns some of our administrators," admitted Secretary Morrison. "They worry that acknowledging past wrongs might undermine governmental authority." "In my experience," Margaret replied firmly, "truth-telling enhances rather than undermines legitimate authority. People respect leaders who acknowledge mistakes and work to correct them. They lose faith in institutions that persist in maintaining obvious falsehoods." The conversation continued for several hours, covering everything from curriculum design to community governance structures. Margaret was pleased to discover that the officials had done their homework, asking sophisticated questions about implementation, challenges, and long-term sustainability. As the delegation prepared to depart, Secretary Morrison made an unexpected request. "Would you consider coming to Washington to brief senior administrators about your work? The Secretary believes your insights could influence national policy regarding Western development." Margaret considered the offer carefully. She had always been more interested in practical implementation than policy advocacy, but the opportunity to shape approaches that might affect thousands of communities was compelling. "I'll consider it," she replied finally, "but any policy recommendations would need to respect the autonomy of local communities. What works here might need significant adaptation elsewhere." That evening, as Margaret sat in her garden watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from a missionary's wife seeking to build a single integrated school to an influential voice in territorial development policy. The sounds of the community settling into the evening. Routine surrounded her. Children playing in multiple languages, adults discussing the day's work, the distant laughter from the tavern where people from various backgrounds shared meals and stories. It was the sound of a society that had learned to weave difference into strength rather than allowing it to become division. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new responsibilities. The railroad would continue to bring changes that would test the resilience of everything they had built. Political pressures from distant capitals would require careful navigation. The next generation of students would need preparation for a world that was evolving more rapidly than ever before. But tonight, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that the principles of truth, respect, and education had proven stronger than the forces of hatred and ignorance that had once seemed insurmountable. The woman who had been captured as a symbol of cultural conflict had become the architect of cultural synthesis, proving that individual courage, guided by unwavering commitment to truth, could indeed transform the world. The decision to travel to Washington came 3 months later, prompted by a crisis that threatened to undermine everything Margaret had spent decades building. Reports reached the valley of a massacre at Wounded Knee, where military forces had killed hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children. The tragedy sparked renewed calls for aggressive military action against all native populations, regardless of their peaceful intentions or established treaty relationships. Margaret understood that her voice might carry unique weight in the national debate. As a white woman who had voluntarily chosen to live among indigenous peoples, who had documented their humanity and capabilities with scholarly rigor, she possessed credibility that purely indigenous advocates often lacked in the halls of government. Power. The journey to the capital took 2 weeks by train, a stark contrast to the months-long wagon journey that had originally brought her west. Margaret used the travel time to prepare her presentation, reviewing decades of documentation about successful integration and the students who had emerged from her educational programs. Washington in 1891 bustled with the energy of a nation confident in its expanding power. Electric lights illuminated government buildings, where decisions affecting millions of lives were made by men who had never ventured beyond the Mississippi River. Margaret walked through the marble corridors of the Department of Interior, carrying a leather satchel filled with student letters, photographs of integrated community events, and statistical analyses of economic and social outcomes in the experimental valley. Mrs. Hayes, Secretary of Interior John Noble, greeted her in his ornate office. "Your reputation precedes you. I confess, I'm curious to meet the woman who reportedly tamed savage Comanche warriors with nothing but alphabet lessons." Margaret bristled at the characterization, but maintained her diplomatic composure. "I didn't tame anyone, Mr. Secretary. I learned from them while sharing knowledge that proved mutually beneficial. The Comanche were never savage. They were simply defending their homeland against invasion." Secretary Noble's eyebrows rose at her directness. "That's rather unconventional perspective on frontier conflicts." "It's an accurate perspective," Margaret replied firmly. "One based on 30 years of direct experience rather than newspaper sensationalism or political convenience." The meeting that followed challenged every assumption about federal Indian policy. Margaret presented evidence that integrated communities outperformed both segregated white settlements and traditional reservations in virtually every measurable category: economic productivity, educational achievement, crime rates, health outcomes, and social stability. "The children educated in integrated environments show remarkable adaptability," she explained, spreading photographs across the secretary's desk. "They become effective advocates for their communities because they understand multiple cultural frameworks. They serve as natural diplomats because they've learned to navigate differences rather than fear it." Secretary Noble studied the photographs with growing interest. "These are native children? Native, white, and mixed heritage children learning together," Margaret corrected. "The girl in the center, Little Hawk, now Dr. Catherine Hawthorne, is conducting research that's revolutionizing agricultural practices throughout the territory. The boy beside her, Thomas Blackbear, serves as a translator for federal court proceedings. The white girl on the left, Rebecca Morrison, has established 3 more integrated schools in neighboring territories." Impressive individual success. "Stories," the secretary acknowledged, "but can such approaches work on a larger scale?" Margaret had anticipated this question. "That depends on whether federal policy supports or undermines local integration efforts. Communities that receive government backing for educational innovation thrive. Those that face bureaucratic obstacles or military interference struggle." She opened her satchel and withdrew a thick folder of correspondence. "I've brought letters from territorial governors, military commanders, federal judges, and business leaders who have worked with graduates of integrated educational programs. They unanimously recommend expanding such approaches." The conversation continued for over 3 hours, ranging across topics from constitutional law to economic development theory. Margaret found herself educating a man who held enormous power over indigenous people's lives, but who had never actually spoken with an Indian person at length. "Your arguments are compelling," Secretary Noble admitted as the meeting concluded. "But implementing such policies would require overriding significant congressional opposition. Many representatives view any approach other than complete assimilation as dangerous appeasement." "Then perhaps," Margaret suggested, "those representatives need education about what actually works versus what merely sounds politically appealing. The secretary laughed despite himself. "You're remarkably direct for a woman seeking governmental favor." "I'm seeking justice, not favor," Margaret corrected, "and I've learned that directness serves truth better than diplomatic evasion." That evening, Margaret attended a reception hosted by the Women's National Indian Association, where she met other advocates working to influence federal policy. The gathering included white reformers, educated indigenous leaders, and mixed heritage, individuals who had navigated between cultures with varying degrees of success. Mrs. Hayes approached a distinguished woman in her 40s. "I'm Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins. I've read about your work in Nevada Territory with great interest." Margaret recognized the name immediately. Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins was a northern Paiute woman who had served as interpreter and advocate for her people, writing extensively about the need for educational reform and humane treatment of indigenous populations. "Your autobiography influenced my thinking about educational approaches," Margaret replied warmly. "Your insights about the damage caused by forced assimilation helped me develop alternative methods." The two women found themselves in deep conversation about the challenges of bridging cultural divides while preserving indigenous identity. Despite their different backgrounds, they shared remarkably similar perspectives on the transformative power of education guided by respect rather than domination. "The government officials I've spoken with don't understand the difference between education and cultural destruction," Sarah observed. "They assume that learning English automatically means abandoning tribal identity, which is exactly backwards," Margaret agreed. "Strong cultural identity actually enhances rather than impedes academic achievement. Children who are proud of their heritage approach new learning with confidence rather than defensive resistance." Their conversation was overheard by other reception and guests, gradually drawing a crowd of interested listeners. Margaret found herself conducting an impromptu seminar on educational philosophy, sharing specific examples from her decades of teaching experience. "The key insight," she explained to the assembled group, "is that cultural knowledge and academic skills are complementary rather than competitive. A child who learns traditional ecological observation methods becomes better at scientific inquiry. Not worse. A child who grows up bilingual develops enhanced cognitive flexibility that serves them in all subject areas." Dr. Carlos Montezuma, a Yavapai physician who had become one of the first Native Americans to graduate from medical school, joined the discussion with enthusiasm. "Mrs. Hayes speaks from practical experience that many educational theorists lack. I've seen too many bright children destroyed by boarding schools that tried to eliminate their cultural identity as the price of academic advancement." The evening's discussions continued until nearly midnight, with participants sharing experiences, debating approaches, and developing strategies for influencing federal policy. Margaret felt energized by the intellectual engagement and the opportunity to learn from advocates who had fought similar battles in different contexts. The following day brought meetings with congressional representatives, some receptive to new approaches and others rigidly committed to existing policies regardless of their demonstrable failures. Margaret quickly learned to tailor her presentations to her audience, emphasizing economic benefits for conservatives, humanitarian concerns for progressives, and educational outcomes for those interested in practical results. Congressman Bradley, she addressed a particularly skeptical representative from Massachusetts. "Your own state prides itself on educational innovation. What I'm proposing is simply extending that innovation to populations previously excluded from its benefits." "But surely you understand the difference between educating civilized children and attempting to educate." "Well, Indians," Congressman Bradley replied with obvious discomfort. Margaret's response was swift and pointed. "I understand that prejudice masquerades as principle when people want to justify treating others as less than human. The Comanche Children I've taught learn as quickly and think as clearly as any children you'll find in Boston classrooms." The congressman's face reddened at her directness, but several other attendees nodded approvingly. Margaret was discovering that many federal officials privately questioned current policies, but lacked the political courage to challenge entrenched interests. Her most productive meeting came with General Oliver Howard, a Civil War veteran who had extensive experience with Indian affairs and a reputation for fairness in his dealings with tribal leaders. Unlike many military officers, Howard had observed successful peaceful settlements and understood their strategic value. "Mrs. Hayes," the general began, "I've read Colonel Harrison's reports about your work with great interest. His success in negotiating peaceful resolutions to potential conflicts has not gone unnoticed by military leadership." Margaret settled into her chair, sensing an opportunity for substantive discussion. "General Howard, I've learned that most conflicts arise from misunderstanding rather than irreconcilable differences. When people can communicate effectively, they usually discover shared interests. Explain how this applies to current tensions." "In other territories," Howard requested, Margaret outlined specific strategies for de-escalating conflicts through education and cultural exchange. She described how young people trained in multiple cultural frameworks could serve as interpreters and mediators, how integrated communities could provide models for peaceful coexistence, and how respect for indigenous knowledge could benefit all settlers. "The tragedy at Wounded Knee occurred partly because of communication failures," she argued. "If military commanders had access to cultural interpreters who understood both sides, if tribal leaders had advocates who could navigate federal bureaucracy, if children from both communities learned together and built relationships that transcended ethnic boundaries, such catastrophes might be prevented." General Howard listened intently, occasionally asking detailed questions about implementation challenges and resource requirements. His military mind appreciated concrete strategies and measurable outcomes rather than abstract moral arguments. "Your approach appeals to me because it's practical," he acknowledged. "But implementing it would require cooperation from civilian administrators who may be less concerned with long-term stability than with short-term political advantages. Which is why military leadership needs to advocate for policies that actually work," Margaret replied. "Officers who understand the real costs of continued warfare have moral authority that politicians often lack." The general nodded thoughtfully. "I'll consider your recommendations carefully. The army has no interest in fighting unnecessary wars against people who might become productive citizens if given the opportunity." Margaret's week in Washington concluded with a public lecture at the Smithsonian Institution, where she presented her research to an audience of scholars, government officials, and interested citizens. The lecture hall was packed, with many attendees standing along the walls to hear what the Eastern press had begun calling the woman who made peace with savages. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, "I did not make peace with anyone. I learned peace from people who understood that survival required cooperation rather than conquest. My role was simply to facilitate communication between groups that had been taught to see each other as enemies." The lecture that followed challenged fundamental assumptions about civilization, progress, and cultural hierarchy. Margaret presented evidence that indigenous societies possessed sophisticated knowledge systems, effective governance structures, and educational approaches that could benefit all Americans. "The question before us is not whether native peoples can be civilized," she declared. "They already possess civilization, different from European models, but no less sophisticated. The question is whether we can be wise enough to learn from their knowledge while sharing our own." The response was immediate and intense. Some audience members applauded enthusiastically while others sat in stunned silence. Several professors peppered her with challenging questions about cultural relativism and assimilation policy. Margaret answered each inquiry with specific examples from her decades of experience, maintaining that evidence should guide policy rather than prejudice. Dr. John Wesley Powell, the renowned explorer and ethnologist, approached her after the lecture with obvious excitement. "Mrs. Hayes, your work validates theoretical predictions about cultural synthesis that few scholars have been able to test in practice. Would you consider collaborating on a comprehensive study of integration outcomes?" Margaret was intrigued by the possibility of academic partnership. "What kind of study did you have in mind?" "A systematic analysis of educational approaches across multiple integrated communities, with statistical comparisons to segregated alternatives," Powell explained. "Your practical experience combined with scientific methodology could produce evidence that might finally convince skeptical policymakers." The collaboration that emerged from this conversation would eventually produce groundbreaking research that influenced educational policy for generations. But that night, as Margaret returned to her hotel room, exhausted but exhilarated by the day's intellectual exchanges, she reflected on how far she had traveled from the frightened missionary's wife who had been captured in Devil's Canyon decades earlier. The capital city bustled outside her window, electric lights illuminating a rapidly changing nation. Somewhere in that urban maze, decisions were being made that would affect the lives of millions of people across the expanding frontier. Margaret had done everything possible to ensure that those decisions would be informed by truth rather than prejudice, by evidence rather than assumption. Tomorrow she will begin the long journey back to the valley that had become her true home, carrying with her commitments from federal officials to support expanded integration programs and funding for educational research. More importantly, she carried the knowledge that truth-telling in the corridors of power could be as transformative as truth-telling in frontier classrooms. The girl, who had never learned to lie, had discovered that honesty remained her most powerful weapon, even in the sophisticated political environment of the nation's capital. Her unwavering commitment to speaking truth had opened minds, changed policies, and demonstrated that individual integrity could indeed influence the course of history. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.